Okay, so hey everyone. So we're here today to show you a video. We're basically redoing my Betta tank. So I have a 6.6 gallon fluvial edge. I'm here with my friend Sean, which knows close to nothing about fish, but that doesn't matter. We're going to be commentating on what we did to plant the plants, how to plant them, and kind of how to arrange plants, even though we're not necessarily professionals, or on the contrary, we're not that great, but that doesn't matter. So these are the plants that I bought. I'm sorry, but I don't really remember the names of them. I just know that I have some Anubias in the middle and some stem plants here. So yeah, Sean, what do you think about the plants, you know?
These plants look very attractive, Julian, and honestly, I can't believe that you did all this in such little time. I mean, look how fast you're moving right here.
Yeah, well,
so tell us a little bit of what's going on here.
Well, basically, I'm just taking out the bad decor that I had in my aquarium, and then now I'm trying to visualize, you know, where I'm going to place my plants. So yeah, so what you want to do when you plant stem plants, you want to align all the tips together, and you see that there's a root growth on one of the tips, so you want to make sure that that is under the substrate. So if you have sand or bigger rocks or whatever, it doesn't really matter. The smaller the rocks, the more compact everything is, so the harder it is for nutrients to get in. The larger the rocks, the less compact everything is, and it's not really ideal for plant growth because the nutrients don't really sit in the rock. They just go all the way to the bottom of the aquarium floor. So yeah, Sean, why don't you tell us about your experience filming the video?
Well, I'm not very much experienced in videos, but it was quite an enjoyable experience, I must say. Your hands are very and yeah, so tell us a little bit about the positioning of these plants. Is there anything
Well, naturally you want to keep the taller plants in the back because you don't want to hide the plants in the foreground, obviously. But since this is such a small aquarium, and if you look at a regular size, like let's say a 30 gallon or 40 gallon tank, which is what I'd say about at least 1.5 foot high, the small plants in this aquarium, or the small plants in a big aquarium, are really like the mid-range plants in this aquarium because it's so much smaller. So stem plants will require a relative amount of maintenance in these types of aquariums because they tend to grow really fast. And when they grow really fast, well, they block the light from reaching the bottom of their stem. So what happens is the leaves on the bottom, which you kind of see now because when I bought them from the store, they weren't in ideal condition. The leaves are a bit yellow. That's because they're not getting enough light because the leaves on the top of the stem are preventing the light from going down. So, and it's such a small tank with not necessarily the most ideal light for plant growth, you really want to maintain and trim the stem plants to keep them relatively short.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So
yeah.
what are we looking at here? What, are these like roots?
Well, yeah, those are roots because that plant was in the tank for quite a while. So yeah, if you guys end up like ever uprooting a plant and it has that much root, you can cut the roots. That's not a problem, and it'll even stimulate plant growth. So that can be a good option to do. I didn't decide to do it because, yeah. So
okay, so I see you're like breaking up that brown stuff there. What exactly is...
Well, no, now what I'm doing is I'm taking the plants out of the pot, but then they're surrounded by some cotton to keep the roots moist, because when, you know, they sell the plants, they don't want the roots to just dry up and waste away and die in the plastic bag. So yeah, always undo plants when you buy them, because you don't want to stick them together too much, because once again, you'll be like creating competition between the different plants, so they'll be competing for sunlight and nutrients, because even aquatic plants feed off of the nutrients in the substrate, so all of the detritus that the fish basically excrete and all of the fish that decomposes will sink to the bottom of the tank and will then be absorbed by the plant. So if you have a well-planted tank that basically, well, where plants cover the whole floor, you don't really, well, first of all, you can't really vacuum the substrate because you'll be going to be uprooting all the plants and kind of ruining all your work, but the plants will recycle all of the relatively toxic stuff in the substrate and use it to grow. So it's kind of a win-win situation, especially if you're somewhat lazy like I am, so it turns out pretty good. So
yeah, I see.
So yeah, right now, like when you want to plant a plant, make sure you hold the tip of the roots when you push the plant in the gravel, because you don't want to damage the roots or you don't want to break the roots, because it's rather counterproductive. And you know, to make sure that they stay under the gravel, you have to plant them deep enough. So right now, you know, I'm just reorganizing plants because, you know, creating an aquascape can take a decent amount of time, because you're gonna plant it, look at it, say, oh, you know what, I think I'd rather move things around a bit. Then you move things around and you really want to try and find something that you like. But if you've never really done it before, like us, well, it's going to take a while. And even now we're still in the process of deciding, or I'm in the process. Sean doesn't spend his time staring at my tanks.
So we see a fish here. What type of fish is that, actually?
Well, that's a better fish, Sean.
Interesting.
Now, the reason why he's alone is because he's a very aggressive fish.
Oh.
But normally these fish are kept in very small bodies of water just because they can survive, but it's not their ideal life condition, because, and condition to live in, because they need a heated tank. They'd prefer a tank with no filter, but if you do, because like the fish is not used to current, so if you do put a filter, try and keep it on like a low flow so that it produces the current. So yeah, that's the fish. But the fish can be with other tank mates, but they have to be like specifically chosen so that he won't just destroy the other fish, and the other fish won't be nipping at his fins.
So you could say that the betta fish is a limiting reagent in this tank.
Precisely, Sean. The betta fish is a limiting reagent.
Very interesting. So what's going on here?
Well, yeah. So, you know, like when you want to have a planted tank, you need to have more substrate than if you didn't want to have a planted tank, because you need to be able to anchor the plants in the substrate, and you want to be able to like accumulate enough nutrients in the substrate. So it's recommended to have at least 3/4 of an inch of substrate. So what I'm doing is I'm just taking some from the front and putting it in the back to try and make sure that the plants don't float back to the top.
So when taking plants out and putting them in, there's a lot of stuff that comes out. How does this get filtered out with the filter, or?
Well, yeah. Well, I originally didn't have a filter in this tank because I only had one fish, and the fish that prefers not to have a filter, so it would just simply sink back to the bottom. If you do have a filter, though, it will obviously get filtered out.
Oh. So that's a pretty powerful light there. Is this absolutely needed for this tank, or?
Well, the light that's there isn't the most powerful of lights, which is why the plants that I bought are plants that are relatively low. Well, they don't demand much light, so hopefully it's going to work out and they won't just all die on me, because when you buy plants, you have to buy them according to like 3 parameters, which is basically their need of, or the amount of light they need, the pH that they can live in, and the hardness that they can live in, because your water can vary between, like, let's say pH of 6 and a pH of 8, and some plants fare best in, let's say, an acidic pH, and other ones fare best in a basic pH. The hardness also can have an effect, but not as big as a pH. But the most important part is the lighting. If you don't have specific lights made for plant growth, and you buy high demanding plants, or plants that require lots of light, they will most likely die within the first couple of weeks. Also, to stimulate plant growth, well, there's fertilizers you can buy. Just like you'd fertilize your lawn, you'd fertilize the water in your tank, so you'd have to put some in every water change. And you can also install a CO2 system, which gives out CO2 so the plants can perform photosynthesis.
So you mentioned the water hardness. What exactly does that mean?
To be honest with you, Sean, I could only try and make up a sort of definition on water hardness, but it's one of the parameters of water. It's not the most important one, but there are buffers that can lower the hardness or increase the hardness, which usually they really recommend using them, because the fish prefer water that is treated, but I couldn't really tell you exactly what the hardness is. Just like I can say, oh, pH depends on the amount of positive H plus ions in water. So yeah, I can't really do that. But I will Google it, and I might just make a video on water hardness and all of the health impacts it can have on fish and plants, just for you, Sean.
Thank you. So I noticed you put a massive rock on the left side here.
Yeah,
right side.
Well, yeah. In theory, I should have placed it at. You want to have like your focal point on one of the thirds of the aquarium. So if you divide your aquarium into 3, you'd want to place the focal point either on the left third or on the right third or 2/3 of the way, depending on how you want to say it, because it's more appealing to the eye. And it's the same thing in photography. When you take pictures, you want to place your subjects on one of the thirds just to make it more appealing to the eye. But even though it's kind of hard to put this rock standing kind of in the middle, and the tank is so small that it doesn't really matter. But then when we move the stuff around, I'm looking at the tank right now, and it is at one of the thirds, so it all works out in the end.
So how do these different plants actually affect the fish inside?
Well, having plants in the fish, they release oxygen into the water when there's light, because they do photosynthesis. At night, they do the reverse, so they would be using oxygen and releasing CO2. So if you have a lot of plants and a lot of fish, you might want to install an air pump to pump air or oxygen into the water so that the fish will not suffocate, because fish can actually suffocate. Even though they live in water, they can suffocate. But the betta fish breathes at the surface of the air at the water, so it doesn't matter. He can live in very bad water conditions and still be okay.
But do you think the fish find it visually appealing? Or?
Oh, sorry, I wasn't done answering the question. Well, yeah, no, plants obviously make the environment feel more natural to the fish. I don't know to what extent this can be like scientifically proven how fish feel when they're enclosed between like 6 or 5, depending on the tank, rectangles of glass. But I'm sure the more you try to replicate the initial environment of the fish, even though bettas were like are originally from Thailand in like very shallow watered rice paddies, and this has nothing to do with the rice paddy, but adding plants just adds a more natural feel to the tank, and it's very appealing to the eye. And they also help reduce the amount of algae you get in the water, because they compete. The plants basically compete with algae because they both feed off the same organisms that are in the water. If you have algae problems, it's recommended to first of all plant plants, and second of all to do more frequent water changes, and that will diminish the amount of algae you have in the plant. I mean, in the tank.
So I noticed there's another arm here.
Yes, well,
I think that's my arm.
That's your arm holding the rock, because I'm grabbing some substrate from my container on the floor to try and keep this rock upright, because it wouldn't be, very interesting if it would fall on one of the fish and end its life right there.
So what else do we have on the top of the tank here that isn't inside yet?
Well, a couple of plants that I took out from before, and basically all the cotton and stuff that were wrapping the roots. So yeah, don't be shy to add substrate into the tank. You can also play a lot of like scenic games, like create mountains in the tank, but if you do that, you won't be able to really siphon, because if you siphon, it'll flatten out the whole landscape eventually. Also, what they recommend doing, they meaning the professional fish people, if you have less substrate in the front and more in the back, you create an illusion of the tank being bigger, because it's like an upward slope. So that's one of the things you might want to keep in mind when trying to figure out your aquascape. And also the color of the substrate is still relatively important, because it really all depends on what effect you want to have. White substrate makes it look very peaceful. The light reflects off it nicely. Black substrate, on the other hand, really allows you to notice the color of the fish because of the contrast between, let's say, the red or the blue of the fish under the light and the black gravel. So here what I'm doing now is I'm trimming the stem plants, and I'm just going to replant them. So you can basically take one stem, cut it up 4 times, and you'd have for new plants, because when you plant them in the gravel, since they're stem plants, they can absorb the nutrients through the stem and then grow roots down the road. So it's interesting because you don't need to buy that many to then get a lot, and you don't want them to be too long because they're going to block the light for all the other plants. So yeah, you just take align them at the bottom, put your fingers under the rocks with the stem, and then bury it. And that's basically how you plant plants. Depending on what style you're looking for, it'll choose what type of plants you want. You can also buy driftwood to add some sort of another dimension, and that's it.
Wow, I learned a lot today.
So how are you going to reapply this into your day-to-day life, Sean?
I might just get an aquarium of my own, maybe.
Really, eh? Well, yeah, it's a quite expensive hobby, unfortunately. Maybe you can DIY some stuff at home, you know?
You're trying to say something. So, yeah. It was a very informative video, I think.
Well, thanks for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed our quick video here on how to plant plants and create a very basic aquascape. We will be keeping you updated on the progression of how the plants grow and how I decided to rearrange the landscape to try and optimize plant growth and prevent them from dying. So, thanks for watching, guys.